On a quiet March morning in Burkina Faso, a modest agricultural site unexpectedly turned into a symbol of something far larger than a local farming project. What seemed at first like a routine visit quietly revealed a deeper shift in how power, food security, and national independence are now being discussed across West Africa today. At the center stood Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader insisting that real emancipation does not begin with speeches or ceremonies, but with land, production, and economic autonomy for women across the country. If this vision spreads beyond one farming perimeter, the political and social consequences could ripple far beyond Burkina Faso. Most people watching the events unfolding in Burkina Faso believe they are simply witnessing another political shift in a distant African country. Yet beneath the surface, a deeper transformation is quietly taking shape, one that challenges long-standing assumptions about power, development, and independence across the region. In the next few minutes, you will see how a single policy direction, centered on agriculture, women's autonomy, and national production could reshape how Burkina Faso positions itself economically and politically in the years ahead. This is not just a story about a speech or a symbolic celebration. It is about understanding the real stakes behind the message delivered by Ibrahim Traoré and the broader strategy now unfolding around it. If someone only hears fragments of this narrative, it is easy to misunderstand what is actually happening. Without the full context, many observers reduce the story to simple political rhetoric, missing the deeper structural changes that are gradually taking place on the ground. Ignoring these details risks missing a much larger shift that could redefine how Burkina Faso approaches sovereignty, development, and social transformation. The moment itself seemed simple at first: a visit to an agricultural perimeter, a gathering of women farmers, and a speech marking International Women's Day. Yet within that setting, Ibrahim Traoré framed something that went far beyond a ceremonial message. Instead, he pointed to a broader national strategy that connects agricultural production, women's autonomy, and economic independence. One detail stood out immediately. In the span of roughly 1 year, the government moved from observing the difficult conditions faced by women farmers at the Zongo agricultural perimeter to establishing structured support that allowed production to continue year-round. From seasonal survival to continuous production signals a practical transformation rather than a symbolic one. To understand why this matters, it helps to look briefly at the contexts surrounding Burkina Faso today. The country is navigating a complex period marked by security challenges, economic pressure, and debates about sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré has repeatedly argued that true independence cannot rely on external supply chains alone. This perspective echoes a historical ambition that has appeared before in Burkina Faso's political discourse. The idea of food self-sufficiency has long been associated with earlier revolutionary efforts to reduce dependence on imports and strengthen domestic agriculture. By emphasizing local production again, the current leadership signals that the country is revisiting that objective under new circumstances. For many observers, the key question is not simply whether the policy exists, but whether it can scale. Agricultural modernization programs have already included equipment distribution and structural support aimed at expanding productivity. One example frequently cited is the distribution of hundreds of tractors intended to modernize farming capacity across the country. But the focus on women adds a distinct dimension to the strategy. In many rural communities, women play a central role in both food production and household stability. When access to land, irrigation tools, and cooperative structures expands, the immediate impact is often felt directly within families and local markets. This is precisely the point Ibrahim Traoré emphasized during his remarks. Rather than framing women's empowerment primarily through symbolic recognition or public celebration, he argued that real emancipation emerges through economic autonomy. When women produce, sell, and manage their own output, the idea of empowerment becomes measurable rather than rhetorical. That perspective also reflects the difficult social realities many women face in Burkina Faso today. Ongoing instability has displaced families, and in many cases women have become heads of households responsible for sustaining entire families. Access to productive land and economic activity becomes more than a policy, it becomes a survival mechanism. Yet this shift also raises broader questions about how development itself is defined. If agricultural production becomes a central pillar of national strategy, then economic independence is no longer simply a macroeconomic objective. It becomes tied to everyday activity in fields, markets, and cooperatives. This is where the significance of Ibrahim Traoré's message begins to extend beyond one speech or one agricultural site. The emphasis on production, local transformation of resources, and technical education suggests an attempt to link agriculture, industry, and social structure into a single development pathway. And that raises an important point that many outside observers are only beginning to notice when local production expands. The effects rarely remain confined to one sector. A useful way to understand this moment is to look at the figure guiding the narrative. Ibrahim Traoré has repeatedly presented himself not simply as a political leader, but as someone attempting to redirect the country's development priorities toward production and self-reliance. His speeches often return to the same core idea: sovereignty is not only a political condition but an economic capability built through work, land, and local industry. During the visit to the agricultural perimeter, that perspective appeared in practical terms. Women working the land described how access to irrigated plots, equipment, and organized cooperatives changed the rhythm of their production. What had once been limited to short seasonal harvests began to extend across more months of the year. In another nearby production zone, similar patterns started to emerge. Groups of women organized into cooperatives were able to cultivate vegetables and maize more consistently, allowing them to supply local markets rather than depend solely on sporadic harvests. Observers following Ibrahim Traoré's approach often point out that these local examples serve a strategic purpose. They create visible demonstrations of policy in action, can show tangible results for new agricultural programs. The narrative of national self-sufficiency begins to feel more credible. Yet these early changes also reveal how fragile the process still is. Agricultural transformation does not happen overnight. Infrastructure, training, logistics, and stable markets all need to evolve together. That means the initiatives now being promoted under Ibrahim Traoré represent the opening stages of a longer national experiment. And from that point forward, the story stops being simple. Everything accelerated quickly. At first, the shifts seemed gradual. Agricultural support programs expanded quietly, equipment began reaching rural areas, and local authorities started organizing women into structured production cooperatives. Then the pace began to change. One decision triggered the chain. Government planners identified several agricultural perimeters that could be rapidly developed with irrigation, machinery, and technical support. Almost immediately, construction and land preparation began. Fields that once struggled through seasonal drought suddenly gained access to water systems capable of sustaining crops beyond the traditional growing cycle. Production followed. Fresh maize appeared in March. Vegetables began circulating in markets earlier than expected. What had once been a narrow agricultural window began stretching across more months of the year. For many communities, that alone represented a dramatic shift. Momentum built quickly. Cooperatives formed, women organized production schedules, local agricultural technicians moved between sites offering guidance on planting cycles and crop management. Small pockets of coordinated farming activity started appearing across multiple regions. The policy signal was clear. Ibrahim Traoré framed these efforts as part of a broader national objective: food sovereignty. In speeches and field visits, he repeatedly argued that a country dependent on imported food could never truly control its own future. Must become a national foundation. The machinery arrived. Reports circulated that hundreds of tractors were distributed to support agricultural modernization. Mechanization allowed farmers to prepare larger fields more efficiently, reducing the physical strain that had historically limited expansion in many rural communities. But the transformation was not limited to farming alone. Another phase followed quickly. Authorities began discussing small-scale processing and local transformation of agricultural products. Instead of exporting raw materials or selling crops immediately after harvest, communities would gradually develop the ability to process and add value locally. The strategy widened. Programs encouraging women to engage in food processing started to emerge. Traditional knowledge methods of transforming local crops into preserved foods and market products became part of a broader economic conversation. Education entered the equation. Officials began emphasizing technical and vocational training for young women. The idea was simple but ambitious: future technicians could design or maintain machinery that supports local agricultural processing industries. This would link agriculture, manufacturing, and education into a single development chain. Yet every rapid change creates its own aftershocks. In many villages, the sudden expansion of production required new distribution channels. Markets needed to absorb larger quantities of vegetables and grain. Transport networks faced pressure to move products efficiently between rural zones and urban consumers. And social dynamics shifted as well. Women who once worked primarily within household economies were increasingly participating in cooperative structures and local commerce. With that came new financial responsibilities, new community roles, and sometimes new tensions within traditional structures. Still, the momentum continued. Each new agricultural perimeter, each cooperative formed, each tractor delivered reinforced the broader message Ibrahim Traoré was attempting to send: Burkina Faso must produce more of what it consumes. But beneath that momentum lies a deeper question. Can these changes grow fast enough to reshape an entire national economy? To answer that question, the discussion eventually returns to numbers. Speeches and symbolic visits can attract attention. But long-term credibility depends on measurable change. In the case of Burkina Faso's current agricultural push, several figures help illustrate the scale of what is being attempted. The first number reflects the modernization effort. Around 400 tractors have reportedly been distributed as part of the government's agricultural support program. In practical terms, that means hundreds of farming zones gaining access to mechanized field preparation that previously relied almost entirely on manual labor. Mechanization alone can significantly expand how much land can be cultivated each season. The second figure concerns production rhythm. Traditionally, many small farmers in Burkina Faso depended heavily on seasonal rainfall, which meant that harvest periods were limited to narrow windows during the year. With irrigated agricultural perimeters and improved equipment, some cooperatives have begun producing crops outside those traditional cycles. Earlier than the typical seasonal harvest illustrates how extended production periods may gradually reshape local food supply patterns. The third set of numbers relates to human impact. Ongoing instability has displaced large segments of the population, and in many cases women have become heads of households responsible for sustaining entire families. That reality makes economic participation critical. Tools and cooperative structures, they are not only improving output but also creating pathways for families to rebuild financial stability. Taken together, these figures reveal something important. The strategy being promoted under Ibrahim Traoré is not limited to symbolic empowerment programs. Instead, it attempts to link three measurable dimensions: agricultural capacity, production continuity, and household economic resilience. This combination changes the way empowerment itself is defined. Rather than measuring progress through declarations or celebrations, the emphasis shifts toward production volumes, stable harvest cycles, and income-generating activity. In other words, the concept of emancipation becomes tied directly to economic participation. Still, numbers alone do not guarantee success. Agricultural expansion depends on many variables that remain uncertain: infrastructure, climate stability, logistics networks, and consistent market demand. Each of those factors can determine whether early improvements turn into long-term transformation. Yet one conclusion already stands out. The discussion surrounding women's empowerment in Burkina Faso is increasingly being framed not as a social slogan, but as an economic strategy. Any serious analysis of the situation must also acknowledge that not everyone interprets these developments in the same way. Different observers, both inside and outside Burkina Faso, have raised questions about the long-term implications of the strategy now associated with Ibrahim Traoré. Those concerns form an important part of the broader debate. One argument often presented by critics focuses on economic realism. Some analysts suggest that expanding agricultural programs and distributing machinery may not automatically translate into sustained national self-sufficiency. They argue that without large-scale infrastructure, stable export routes, and long-term investment, the impact of these initiatives could remain limited to local improvements rather than nationwide transformation. However, supporters of the approach respond with a different interpretation. They point out that many successful agricultural revolutions in other countries began exactly this way, through localized improvements that gradually scaled outward. According to this view, the early stages of development rarely appear impressive on paper, yet they create the structural base required for larger economic growth later. A second criticism focuses on the political environments surrounding these reforms. Some commentators worry that heavy emphasis on national sovereignty and anti-imperial rhetoric could isolate Burkina Faso economically or diplomatically. They argue that cooperation with international partners remains essential for development, particularly in areas such as technology transfer, infrastructure funding, and trade. In response, supporters of Ibrahim Traoré emphasize that the objective is not isolation but autonomy. Reducing excessive dependence on imports, especially in food production, does not mean rejecting international cooperation. It means negotiating from a stronger position once domestic production becomes more stable. When these competing viewpoints are placed side by side, the debate becomes clearer. On one side are those who see the reforms as ambitious but risky, requiring careful economic management and global cooperation. On the other side are those who believe Burkina Faso must first rebuild its productive capacity before engaging the international system on equal footing. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Understanding the future of these policies therefore requires looking beyond slogans or headlines and examining how the strategy unfolds over time. Then something unexpected changed the tone of the entire conversation. A different definition of emancipation emerged. For years, international discussions about women's empowerment often revolved around symbolic representation, policy declarations or global campaigns, yet the message Ibrahim Traoré delivered during the agricultural visit pointed in another direction entirely. Production first. Instead of defining empowerment through recognition alone, the emphasis shifted toward economic capability. Women cultivating land, organizing into cooperatives, processing agricultural products, and participating in local industries began to represent a different model of autonomy. That shift matters, because once economic independence becomes the foundation of empowerment, the conversation moves away from symbolism and toward measurable activity. Land access, irrigation, machinery, and cooperative structures become the real indicators of progress. In that moment, the narrative surrounding the policy subtly changed. The discussion was no longer only about social recognition. It was about economic participation, productivity, and the role women could play in reshaping local supply chains. When Ibrahim Traoré described women producing year-round crops and organizing into agricultural groups, he was effectively presenting them as drivers of national resilience. The implications stretch further than one agricultural site. If these programs continue expanding across regions, they could alter how rural economies function. Local markets could become more stable, food availability could increase, and communities previously dependent on external supply chains might gain new forms of self-reliance. And that realization opens an entirely new chapter in the story. Because once production becomes the center of the strategy, the consequences begin to spread outward through every layer of society. The effects of that shift do not remain confined to farmland. Once production increases and local economic activity expands, the consequences begin to appear across several layers of society. The changes may start quietly, but over time they influence institutions, markets, and everyday life. At the government level, the pressure to sustain results becomes immediate. Programs that expand agricultural capacity must continue delivering irrigation systems, equipment, and technical support across multiple regions. If these initiatives stall, the credibility of the strategy itself could weaken. For that reason, officials increasingly frame food production as a matter of national stability rather than simply rural policy. In this context, Ibrahim Traoré positions agricultural self-reliance as part of a broader vision of sovereignty. Businesses feel the effects in a different way. As production grows, opportunities appear for small processing facilities, storage systems, and transport networks. Companies connected to agricultural supply chains begin adjusting their operations to handle greater volumes of crops and vegetables. When local transformation industries develop, such as tomato processing or cashew transformation plants, they create new links between farmers and regional markets. For ordinary citizens, the impact becomes more personal. Families that once depended on uncertain seasonal harvests may gradually experience more consistent food availability and income sources. Women involved in agricultural cooperatives gain greater financial independence, which often changes household dynamics and decision-making patterns. In communities affected by displacement and economic hardship, even modest improvements in agricultural productivity can restore a sense of stability. Beyond Burkina Faso itself, regional observers also pay attention to these developments. West African economies are closely interconnected, and shifts in agricultural output can influence trade flows and food prices across neighboring countries. If domestic production expands significantly, it could reduce reliance on imported food products and alter regional supply patterns. Taken together, these consequences reveal something important. What began as a localized initiative around agricultural empowerment now touches multiple sectors: governance, commerce, social structure, and regional economics. And that is when the broader strategic question begins to emerge. Three possible futures now sit in front of Burkina Faso. The first is the most likely path if current trends continue. Agricultural programs gradually expand, cooperatives stabilize their production cycles, and local processing industries slowly begin absorbing more of the country's raw agricultural output. Burkina Faso does not transform overnight, but it steadily reduces dependence on imported food while strengthening domestic supply chains. Under this outcome, the strategy promoted by Ibrahim Traoré becomes a long-term economic foundation rather than a short political experiment. A second scenario presents a more optimistic trajectory. If irrigation systems expand successfully, if vocational education programs begin producing technicians who support agricultural processing, and if regional markets absorb the growing output, Burkina Faso could accelerate its path toward food self-sufficiency. In that case, agricultural production would not only stabilize domestic supply, but also create new export opportunities within West Africa. The third possibility is more difficult. Agricultural transformation requires stable infrastructure, reliable logistics, and consistent policy execution. Security pressures or financial constraints interrupt the expansion of these programs. The progress achieved so far could slow significantly. The key point is not predicting which scenario will occur. It is recognizing that the direction Burkina Faso chooses today will shape how these possibilities unfold. After looking at the broader picture, a more personal question begins to emerge for anyone watching this story unfold. Once the policies, statistics, and national strategies are set aside for a moment, the real issue becomes how these changes affect ordinary people who follow global events from afar. Some viewers naturally fall into the first group, those who pay close attention to international developments. For them, the policies promoted by Ibrahim Traoré represent an example of how leadership choices can redirect a country's priorities toward production and self-reliance. Understanding these shifts early gives them a clearer lens through which to interpret future political and economic developments across West Africa. A second group experiences the situation more indirectly. They may not live in Burkina Faso, yet global markets, food supply chains, and regional stability influence economies far beyond national borders. Agricultural transformation in one country can affect trade flows, investment patterns, and even international political relationships. There is also a third group, people who initially believe the story has little relevance to their own lives. International news can feel distant, especially when it unfolds thousands of miles away. Yet history often shows that shifts in food production, economic independence, and regional power dynamics rarely remain isolated events. That is why understanding the trajectory of Burkina Faso matters more than it might appear at first glance. When countries attempt to redefine their development models, the outcomes can ripple across entire regions. And the choices made today will influence what comes next. Real change rarely begins with declarations alone. It begins when ideas move from speeches into systems that people can actually see and measure. In the case of Burkina Faso, the strategy associated with Ibrahim Traoré increasingly revolves around turning principles like sovereignty and empowerment into concrete actions that unfold across multiple sectors of society. The first step rests at the national leadership level. Government institutions must continue expanding agricultural infrastructure while ensuring that irrigation systems, machinery distribution, and technical support reach rural communities consistently. Progress would not be measured by announcements, but by tangible indicators such as increased cultivated land, stable harvest cycles, and the number of functioning agricultural cooperatives across the country. The second step involves businesses and economic networks. Local companies and regional investors play a critical role in transforming agricultural output into sustainable economic activity. Processing facilities, storage infrastructure, and distribution systems must grow alongside farming production. When these industries operate effectively, farmers gain reliable markets while the broader economy benefits from added value within domestic supply chains. The third step belongs to communities and individuals themselves. Cooperative leaders, educators, and local technicians become the daily operators of the strategy. Especially those encouraging young women to enter technical and vocational fields, can gradually create the workforce needed to maintain machinery, develop processing equipment, and expand local industries. If these three layers, leadership, economic networks, and community participation, move in coordination, the vision described by Ibrahim Traoré may evolve from an ambitious concept into a functioning development pathway. Ultimately, strategies succeed not because they sound powerful, but because they are implemented consistently over time. Earlier in the story, the scene returns several times to the women working the fields at the agricultural perimeter. That image quietly became the emotional center of the entire narrative. Rows of crops, irrigation lines cutting through dry land, and groups of women coordinating their work together represented more than a farming activity. Looking back, the path of the story now becomes clearer. It began with a simple visit and a speech marking a day dedicated to women. The conversation expanded into agriculture, sovereignty, and the role of production in shaping a nation's future. The message delivered by Ibrahim Traoré linked individual effort with a broader national ambition. At its core, the story is not only about policy or leadership, it is about people trying to build stability under difficult circumstances. Families rebuilding livelihoods, farmers cultivating land through uncertain seasons, and communities attempting to create opportunities where few previously existed. When those efforts connect to a larger vision, they begin to form something stronger than isolated initiatives. They become part of a collective attempt to redefine what development looks like for an entire country. And that realization leaves a final thought. The future of a nation often begins in the quiet work that few people notice. Every viewer will leave this story with a slightly different impression. Some may focus on the political dimension, others on the economic experiment unfolding through agriculture, and some on the social impact of expanding opportunities for women in rural communities. What matters most is not that everyone agrees, but that the conversation continues with deeper understanding. If this story about Burkina Faso and the ideas promoted by Ibrahim Traoré made you pause and think, then it has already served a meaningful purpose. Many developments around the world pass quickly through headlines without giving people time to explore the full context behind them. Sharing thoughtful discussions helps ensure that more people can look beyond surface narratives and consider the broader forces shaping our world today. When perspectives from different backgrounds come together, the conversation becomes richer and more informative for everyone involved. So the real question now moves to you. What do you think is the most important lesson emerging from this moment in Burkina Faso?